May 1945. Across Britain, vast vehicle parks stretch for miles through the countryside near Southampton, Liverpool, and dozens of other ports. Row after row of American trucks are parked in precisely organized formations. Their olive green paint already shows the wear of years of hard service. These are British vehicles now, but their origins are unmistakable. They carry the distinct angular styling of Detroit manufacturers, the rounded hoods of Chevrolet, the flat grills of Ford, the rugged frames of GMC and Studebaker. More than 480,000 American trucks and cargo vehicles crossed the Atlantic under the Lend-Lease program, the vast majority destined for British forces. Now, with victory in Europe secured and Japan's surrender only weeks away, these vehicles present an extraordinary logistical and political challenge. They belong to the United States government. Britain used them, maintained them, and wore them down in service from North Africa to Northwest Europe. But ownership was never transferred. As peace arrives, difficult questions emerge. What happens to nearly 500,000 foreign-owned vehicles scattered across Britain and continental Europe? Can they be purchased? Must they be returned? Should they be destroyed? The answers would expose the harsh financial realities facing post-war Britain and determine the fate of the largest vehicle fleet ever assembled under a single program. The scale of Britain's dependence on American vehicles became fully apparent in the immediate aftermath of victory. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped 427,284 trucks and cargo vehicles to Britain alone, with another 52,000 sent to British Empire forces. These numbers exceeded Britain's own domestic production. The vehicles covered every category: 1.5-ton Dodge weapons carriers, 2.5-ton GMC cargo trucks, 4-ton Diamond T tank transporters, massive 6-ton white heavy haulers, 3/4-ton Chevrolet utility vehicles, and thousands of specialized variants including ambulances, mobile workshops, and radio vans. They formed the backbone of British logistics throughout the war. By May 1945, American vehicles made up approximately 60% of Britain's total military truck fleet. The Eighth Army in Italy depended on them almost entirely. The British Second Army in Germany operated American vehicles at a ratio of 3-to-1 compared to British models. Vehicle parks within Britain alone contained approximately 180,000 American trucks. Another 120,000 sat in depots across France, Belgium, and Germany. Around 85,000 remained in the Mediterranean theater. The rest were scattered from India to Burma, from Egypt to Palestine. Their condition varied dramatically. Some had traveled less than 5,000 miles. Others, especially those in service since North Africa in 1942, showed over 80,000 miles on their odometers and extensive mechanical wear. The immediate challenge was as much political as financial. Lend-Lease law had always been clear. Equipment was loaned, not given. As the war ended, the U.S. government expected either the return of usable equipment or payment for items Britain wished to keep. American officials arrived in Britain just weeks after VE Day to conduct assessments. The Foreign Liquidation Commission, established specifically to handle overseas disposal of Lend-Lease equipment, dispatched teams to inspect vehicle parks and determine values. Their initial position alarmed British officials. The United States wanted the vehicles back, or payment at depreciated but still substantial rates. American proposals suggested vehicles in good condition could cost Britain £400 each, those in fair condition £250, and even worn-out trucks £100. With nearly 500,000 vehicles in British hands, the sums were astronomical. Britain, effectively bankrupt after 6 years of war, could not afford to buy what it had come to rely on. The Foreign Office and Treasury officials struggled to negotiate more favorable terms. American negotiators, led by representatives from the State Department and War Department, initially showed little flexibility. They pointed out that many vehicles, especially those still in Britain, remained in good condition and had clear commercial value. The American automotive industry wanted these vehicles returned or destroyed to avoid competition with post-war production. A flood of surplus U.S. military trucks into European markets could undermine sales of new vehicles. Throughout the summer of 1945, negotiations dragged on while the trucks sat idle, consuming security manpower and deteriorating in the weather. Britain's position became desperate. Foreign currency reserves fell to critically low levels. Every dollar was needed for essential food and raw material imports. Spending hundreds of millions on trucks seemed impossible. Yet Britain's economy required transport capacity for reconstruction. American officials recognized Britain's plight, but faced pressure from Congress to recover Lend-Lease costs and protect domestic manufacturers. September 1945 brought an abrupt turning point. President Truman announced the sudden termination of the Lend-Lease program on August 21st. The decision shocked British officials. Within days, all Lend-Lease shipments stopped. Items already at sea continued to British ports, but the flow dried up entirely. This sudden cutoff intensified pressure to resolve the fate of existing equipment. British negotiators, led by the Ministry of Supply and the War Office, intensified talks with the Foreign Liquidation Commission. Progress came through creative accounting. Rather than purchasing vehicles individually, Britain negotiated a comprehensive settlement covering all retained Lend-Lease material. The Anglo-American Financial Agreement, signed in December 1945, established that Britain would pay £650 million for all Lend-Lease equipment it wished to retain, including trucks. This represented roughly 10% of the equipment's original value. The agreement allowed Britain to keep vehicles deemed essential while requiring the disposal of surplus equipment. Vehicles retained for military use did not require immediate payment, but fell under the broader loan terms. Those transferred to civilian use had to be paid for under the agreement. In early 1946, British authorities began the massive task of classifying nearly 500,000 vehicles into categories: retention for military service, transfer to civilian ministries, sale to Commonwealth nations, scrapping, or abandonment overseas. The Ministry of Supply established regional depots at Tilbury, Donington, Bicester, and elsewhere to process the enormous fleet. Teams of mechanics and administrators worked through the winter of 1945 to 46, inspecting, categorizing, and documenting every vehicle. Approximately 125,000 were deemed essential for continued military service. These included newer, low-mileage models, hard-to-replace specialized variants, and vehicles required for occupation forces in Germany. Another 95,000 vehicles were approved for transfer to civilian government use. The Ministry of Transport took thousands for road maintenance. The Ministry of Agriculture received trucks for forestry operations. Local authorities across Britain acquired American trucks for refuse collection, fire services, and general municipal work. British military authorities faced particular challenges in Germany, where approximately 78,000 American vehicles served with the British Army of the Rhine. Occupation duties required substantial transport capacity, but maintaining such a large foreign fleet proved complex. Spare parts became increasingly difficult to obtain as U.S. military stocks dwindled. The War Office decided to retain around 45,000 American trucks in Germany, primarily newer GMC and Studebaker models, while declaring older vehicles surplus. These surplus vehicles were uneconomical to return to Britain. Shipping costs exceeded their value. Instead, British authorities sold them locally. The Control Commission for Germany established vehicle disposal centers in Hamburg, Hanover, and Nuremberg. German transport companies, desperate for vehicles to rebuild their shattered economy, bought thousands of worn Chevrolet, Dodge, and Ford trucks. Prices remained low, typically £50 to £150 per vehicle, depending on condition. By the end of 1946, around 22,000 American trucks originally supplied to Britain under Lend-Lease had entered German civilian service. They became a common sight on German roads, often repainted and bearing German license plates, quietly aiding reconstruction. Meanwhile, Commonwealth negotiations continued throughout 1946. Canada, which had received 237,000 American vehicles under its own Lend-Lease arrangements, faced similar challenges. Australia received 44,000. Both negotiated reduced-rate settlements with the United States. Britain offered to sell part of its allocation to Commonwealth partners needing transport capacity. New Zealand purchased 3,000 American trucks from British stocks. South Africa took 2,100. India, facing severe transport shortages, received 85,500 vehicles transferred from British military stocks in the Middle East. The Soviet approach to Lend-Lease vehicles, while not directly comparable, provides a striking contrast. The USSR received approximately 427,000 American trucks, nearly identical to Britain's allocation. Unlike Britain, the Soviet Union simply kept everything. When American officials requested accounting and the return of surplus equipment, Soviet authorities offered minimal cooperation. Most American vehicles that survived Soviet service remained in Soviet hands, many serving into the 1950s. Some Studebaker US-6 trucks, particularly favored by Soviet forces, remained in military service into the 1960s. The Soviet refusal to seriously engage in Lend-Lease accounting became one of the early tensions of the Cold War. Britain, despite financial desperation, honored the negotiated agreement. This contrast reflected diverging relationships with the United States as the wartime alliance fractured. Back in Britain, systematic disposal of surplus American vehicles accelerated through 1946 and 1947. Approximately 185,000 vehicles were deemed uneconomical to retain. Those in reasonable mechanical condition but surplus to requirements were auctioned. The Ministry of Supply organized sales at depots across Britain. Private transport firms, still recovering from wartime restrictions, bought thousands of Chevrolet and Ford trucks. Agricultural contractors purchased four-wheel drive Dodges. Construction companies acquired heavy Diamond T and white trucks. Prices ranged from £180 for good-condition 2.5-ton GMCs to as little as £8 for worn Chevrolet utility vehicles. These sales generated approximately £18 million for the Treasury, a modest but welcome sum. Vehicles in poor condition were scrapped. Britain's acute steel shortages in 1946 made scrap valuable. Dealers bought worn American trucks for £15 to £30 each and cut them up in scrap yards in Birmingham, Sheffield, and South Wales. By 1948, approximately 67,000 former Lend-Lease vehicles had been reduced to scrap, their steel feeding Britain's reconstruction. Some vehicles proved uneconomical even to move or process. In remote storage areas, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, clusters of damaged or cannibalized American trucks were simply abandoned. The Ministry of Supply lacked resources to transport them to scrap yards. These vehicles gradually deteriorated through the late 1940s, eventually becoming overgrown wrecks. A few survived into the 1950s before final removal. The Mediterranean theater posed unique disposal challenges. Approximately 62,000 American vehicles in British service remained in Egypt, Palestine, Libya, and Italy in mid-1945. As British forces withdrew, these vehicles became surplus. Middle East Command established disposal centers in Cairo and Alexandria. Thousands of worn vehicles went to Egyptian contractors and transport operators. When Britain withdrew from Palestine in 1948, approximately 8,000 American vehicles were left behind, some falling into Israeli hands, others to Arab forces. In Libya, remnants of desert campaigns littered remote areas. Hundreds of abandoned American trucks, too damaged or remote to recover, slowly disappeared beneath the sand. The integration of retained American vehicles into civilian life transformed British roads through the late 1940s. The boxy profiles of Chevrolet and GMC trucks became familiar sights. Rural fire brigades operated converted Dodge ambulances. Forestry operations relied on four-wheel drive power wagons. Small transport businesses were built around cheap surplus American trucks. These vehicles held advantages over contemporary British trucks. Their simple, rugged engineering made them easy to maintain. Spare parts, though limited, remained available through specialist dealers salvaging components from scrapped vehicles. Powerful engines designed for American conditions handled post-war British overloading well. Fuel consumption, however, proved problematic. American engines, designed when gasoline was cheap and plentiful, consumed far more fuel than British equivalents. As fuel rationing continued into the late 1940s, this became a serious disadvantage. Operating costs forced many civilian users to replace American vehicles with more economical British models by around 1950. The retained military fleet faced different challenges. Through 1946 and 1947, the War Office kept approximately 125,000 American vehicles in service. Spare parts increasingly constrained operations. After 1948, when the U.S. disposed of its own surplus stocks, parts were no longer produced. British military workshops cannibalized damaged vehicles to keep others running. Engineering units fabricated improvised replacement parts. By 1949, the American fleet in British service had fallen to 73,000 vehicles. Further reductions followed between 1950 and 1951 as the Ministry of Supply pushed for standardization on British models. The Korean War briefly extended the life of some vehicles, especially heavy trucks in short supply. But by 1953, British military holdings of American vehicles had fallen to approximately 28,000 units, mostly specialized types or vehicles serving overseas where parts remained available. A small number of American vehicles survived into preservation, rarely through deliberate effort. Museums showed little interest in common military trucks during the 1940s and 1950s. Some vehicles survived through continued civilian use, retained by transport firms, municipal services, or farms long past their economic life. A few entered museum collections in the 1960s. The Imperial War Museum acquired a 2.5-ton GMC CCKW in 1967. The National Motor Museum at Beaulieu later obtained a Dodge WC weapons carrier. The Tank Museum at Bovington preserved a Diamond T-tank transporter, one of the massive vehicles that moved British armor from Normandy to the Rhine. Private collectors began seeking American military vehicles from the 1970s onward. As military vehicle preservation grew into an established hobby, enthusiasts uncovered survivors in farm sheds, scrap yards, and municipal depots. A Studebaker US 6 emerged from a Scottish forestry depot in 1982, still operational after decades hauling timber. Occasional recoveries from remote areas yielded further finds. Several American vehicles abandoned in the Scottish Highlands during post-war training exercises were recovered and restored. Today, British military vehicle collections hold approximately 85 surviving American Lend-Lease trucks in various conditions, perhaps 0.2% of the original fleet. Private collectors own perhaps 200 more, primarily Dodge weapons carriers and Jeeps. Continental Europe holds additional survivors. German museums preserve several American trucks that entered civilian service after 1945. The Overloon War Museum in the Netherlands displays a GMC recovered from a local transport company. The Sinsheim Museum in Germany exhibits an intact Ford G8T that served with British forces before German civilian use. The legacy of Britain's Lend-Lease trucks extends beyond the vehicles themselves. The experience profoundly shaped post-war British military vehicle development. British manufacturers studied American design approaches closely. The simplicity and standardization of U.S. vehicles impressed engineers accustomed to incompatible British wartime models. When Britain developed its next generation of military trucks in the 1950s, such as the Bedford RL series, American influence was evident in simplified maintenance and standardized components. The financial settlement also left lasting political lessons. Britain learned hard truths about reliance on foreign equipment. Negotiating retention terms while effectively bankrupt-shaped defense policy for decades. Subsequent governments prioritized maintaining domestic production capacity for essential military equipment, even at higher cost, to avoid similar vulnerability. The rapid disappearance of nearly 500,000 vehicles also illustrates how quickly even massive programs can vanish. Within 5 years of the war's end, most had been scrapped, sold, or abandoned. Within 10 years, survivors were uncommon. Within 20 years, they were rare. This pattern would repeat with much Cold War military equipment, vast investments that disappeared only decades after obsolescence. The story of Britain's Lend-Lease trucks reveals the unglamorous but essential logistics of the post-war period. The dramatic moment of victory in May 1945 gave way to years of administrative processing, financial negotiation, and systematic disposal. While the race to capture German technology draws more attention, the fate of 500,000 ordinary trucks tells a more fundamental story about post-war Britain. A nation victorious yet financially exhausted, unable even to purchase the vehicles it had worn out in service. The Americans, though ultimately generous in the settlement, still insisted on payment or return. The solution involved creative accounting, mass disposal, and acceptance that the enormous fleet would largely disappear. Today, the few surviving examples serve as tangible reminders of the scale of Allied cooperation and the logistical foundations that sustained victory. GMC and Studebaker trucks displayed in British museums represent not just vehicles, but the industrial power that carried armies across continents. They also remind us how completely the material evidence of even recent history can vanish when economic and practical considerations drive disposal. If you found this story insightful, watch next what happened to Germany's V-2 rockets after World War II, how captured missiles sparked the space race and became the foundation of Cold War ballistic missile programs. Like, subscribe, and click the bell for more. Thank you for watching.